and welcome to Let's Get Lit. In today's video, we're going to go over stave 4 of Charles Dickens' classic A Christmas Carol. We're almost right there at the end. Will Ebenezer learn his lesson? Let's see. Alright, let's begin chapter 4. So, this chapter immediately picks up from where the last one ended. The dark, large, ominous figure approaches Scrooge. Scrooge, being very scared, fell to his knees watching as the figure came towards him. The narrator notes that this figure was tall and had a large black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and everything from Scrooge. Scrooge is so terrified of the spirit, but asks if he is in the presence of Christmas yet to come. The spirit doesn't reply to any of these questions and simply just lifts its head. Though Scrooge was familiar with the two ghosts so far, this one terrified him the most. Scrooge then, gaining up his courage, stands up and tells the spirit to take him where he must, lead him on. Scrooge is then led into the heart of the city. The phantom brings him to a small group that are talking. They talk about someone who has died, and someone who none of them were really great fans of. That this man was a cheap man, and they were all worried about who he left his last remaining money and will and testament to. The group talks about how it should be a cheap funeral, and they don't really expect a lot of people to be there, but they would all show up if lunch was provided. Scrooge really has no idea who the person they're talking about is, and is trying to figure out all of this. Then, the phantom takes him to where two businessmen are talking and meeting. They have a very brief conversation, nothing of great importance on the outside, but saying a lot on the inside. Scrooge knew these two men, but not personally. He knew of them to be businessmen. I wanted to be in high regards to them. They do mention that someone has died, but that's really all they say. The reader is led to believe they're talking about Scrooge, but Scrooge really still doesn't realize this. Next, the spirit takes him to one of the dirty and darker places of town. They make their way to a small little shop that is shrouded in darkness. They enter and go inside. They see an old man smoking a pipe as the last little embers of a fire are going on. Then, a group of people enter into the shop with all sorts of items in their hand. They all sit down to talk to the man. Each one of them has taken things from a dead man, who none of them liked. All of them went into his household after his death and got their hands on whatever they could find. One woman had a small satchel that included a pencil case, a seal or two, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value. Next, a woman who identifies as Miss Dilbert brought sheets and towels, little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. We realize these people are selling off all of these items to the older man with the pipe. All of them are joking and talking about how the man who they took all this from wouldn't have cared because he was such an awful person, and that all these things are no longer needed, so they were taking them off his hands. The older man with the pipe asks Miss Dilbert if she knew what the dead man died from, to which she said just old age and no diseases, because the older man was worried that if the dead man had died from a disease, the blankets and bedding would not have been good to sell. The figure brings him to a small dark room. Scrooge can make out that this is a bed, but that the curtains and the blankets were taken away except for one blanket where something was lying on the bed underneath it. The figure had pointed his hands as if to remove the sheet. However, Scrooge, being so frightened, cannot make himself to pull back the sheet. Scrooge begs the figure to leave this place and to go somewhere else. Again, the figure points towards the body that's laying on the bed, but Scrooge tells him that he cannot pull the covers back. He then asks the spirit if there is anyone in town who feels emotion for this man's death. Please show him that person. The spirit takes him to a small house where a woman is sitting and her children are playing in the background. When the husband comes in, they have a small conversation. The woman asks if it's good news or bad news. The man says bad news. They talk about how a man has died, and the reader realizes that this man was a debtor to the couple. The couple does not know what is going to happen with their debt and what they owe to the old man, which makes them feel happy for at least a brief moment. They talk about how their next creditor should not be as nearly as mean as this old man who just died was. Scrooge then asks the spirit if he can see some tenderness connected with the death. The spirit then takes him to the house of Bob Cratchit. The narrator lets us know that the entire household of the Cratchit family was silent and still. Bob had yet to return, and all of the children and wife were sitting in silence doing their chores. When Bob does come home, everyone rushes to meet him and gives him hugs and kisses. Bob praises the girls and his wife for making such quick work of their tasks, and says that they should be ready by Sunday for sure. Miss Cratchit was astonished that it would happen so soon. Mr. Cratchit said that she should have been there with him, and it was a very lovely green space, but mentions that she will see it very often. Then Mr. Cratchit breaks down and cries. Mr. Cratchit excuses himself from the room to regain himself, then comes back a short while later. They all sit by the fire, and Mr. Cratchit tells of Scrooge's nephew and the extraordinary amount of kindness that he has provided. Mr. Cratchit talks about how while on the streets of London, Scrooge's nephew sees him and stops and talks to him. Fred notices that Mr. Cratchit seems a little down and asks what's going on, to which Mr. Cratchit tells him everything. Fred says that if there is anything he can do, please let him know. Fred hands Mr. Cratchit a business card. They talk about how great of a wife Miss Cratchit is, and again, Fred says, again, if anything he can do, please let him know. They also talk about how great Tiny Tim was. At the end of this story, they all gather together, and Mr. Cratchit says that none of them shall ever forget Tiny Tim and what a great soul he was. Everybody agrees, and they all gather around to give each other hugs and kisses. After seeing all of this, Scrooge tells the spirit that he thinks their parting moment is at hand. Scrooge asks the spirit to tell him who had died. The ghost of Christmas yet to come does not respond. The narrator notes that all of these visions that they have seen were in no particular order, but through each one of them the spirit continues to walk through. As they are walking through the streets, Scrooge says that he knows this place, and that his place of occupation is right down the street. Scrooge says to let him see what shall be in days to come. The spirit stops at his hand and points elsewhere. Scrooge asks, "Why do you point away from my workplace?" Scrooge goes to the window of his office and looks in, but when he looks inside, all he sees is completely different. The furniture and different people inside other than him. When he looks back at the spirit is still pointing in the opposite direction. Scrooge follows the spirit, and they soon enter a churchyard. Scrooge follows the spirit to a particular grave, the one to which the spirit is pointing at. Before Scrooge looks down at the grave, he asks the spirit if these are shadows of things that will be, or if are shadows of things that may only be. Still, the spirit points down to the grave at which it stood. Scrooge says that man's course will foreshadow certain ends, to which if preserved, but if the course be departed from, the end will change. Scrooge says, "It is thus with what you show me." The spirit, however, never moved or changed. Scrooge goes towards the gravestone and reads his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. Scrooge asks if he is the man who lays upon the bed. The figure just pointed to the grave and then back to Ebenezer. At realizing this, Scrooge says that he is not the man that he was. He will not be the man he must have been for this intercourse. Scrooge then asks why show him all of this if he is past all hope. Again, the spirit does not say anything. Scrooge then starts to tremble and exclaim that he will honor Christmas in his heart and try to keep it all year. He will live in the past and the present and the future, and that the spirit of all three shall strive within him. He will not shut out the lessons that they have taught him. He then begs the spirit how he may sponge away these writings on the stone. In Scrooge's agony, he caught the spectral's hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in his entreaty and detained it. The spirit, though stronger yet, repulsed him. Scrooge, holding his hand up in the last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration of the phantom's hood and dress. The phantom then vanished down and became a bedpost. This is where chapter 4 of A Christmas Carol ends. Continue along with us as we go through the last and final chapter of this famous Christmas story. Have a great day, and as always, stay lit.